The calendar has flipped to May, and the clock is ticking down at the Iowa legislature and on the primary election campaign trail. We get insight and analysis from Iowa political reporters on this edition of Iowa Press.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
I'm a dad.
I am a mom.
I'm a kid.
I'm a kid at heart. I'm a banker.
I'm an Iowa banker.
No matter who you are, there is an Iowa banker who is ready to help you get where you want to go. Iowa Bankers, allowing you to discover the genuine difference of Iowa banks.
For decades, Iowa Press has brought you politicians and newsmakers from across Iowa and beyond. Now celebrating more than 40 years of broadcast excellence on statewide Iowa Public Television. This is the Friday, May 4 edition of Iowa Press. Here is David Yepsen.
The signs of spring signal much more than warming temperatures in Iowa. An Iowa legislative session idling in overtime is winding down, and it's crunch time for primary campaigns. The 2018 primary elections are only a month away, with key races for governor and U.S. Congress. Hanging in the balance, and to check the political pulse on the campaign trail, we've gathered a team of reporters Roundtable members. Joyce Russell from Iowa Public Radio. James Lynch writes for the Gazette. Brianne Pfannenstiel is political reporter for the Des Moines Register. And Kay Henderson is news director at Radio Iowa. Well, you're all very busy this time of the year with the session and the primary campaign, so let's cut to the chase.
Oh, my.
Kay, let's talk about the session stuff first. The abortion bill has been the big news up at the Capitol and around the state and politics. What's the political fallout from passage of that legislation?
Well, one of the quotes that I was struck by during the debate, elongated debate, 9 hours in the House and 2.5 hours in the Senate, was a remark that Senator Rick Bertrand made. He said, "Oh, God, isn't it great to see Republicans voting like Republicans?" And I think what this does is it motivates the base in a year in which Republicans may have a hard time motivating the base. So this appeals to evangelical voters and voters who vote on this single issue, and there are many in the Republican coalition who vote solely on abortion. And so when Republican legislative candidates go out there, and they may have problems in a blue wave year, they can tell their base, look, last year we passed an abortion bill that was a 20-week ban. This year, we passed the nation's toughest abortion ban. And so I think that will be something that we hear a lot on the campaign trail.
James?
I was struck by a similar statement in the debate in the House when the floor manager, Shannon Lundgren, made the remark, "We're the majority for a reason." And she thought one of the reasons is Republicans want to see pro-life legislation advance. And that was part of her argument for passing this abortion ban, banning abortions after the 6th week of pregnancy when a fetal heartbeat is detected. It's going to be interesting, though, because there were a lot of Republicans, including some Republican legislators, who thought the 20-week ban passed last year was good enough, that 6 weeks was maybe a step too far.
Joyce, what's your take on this? Does it also have an energizing effect among Democrats and progressives?
Potentially, yes. I mean, this is essentially a ban on all abortions when you get right down to it. And I think it's actually, in the discussions that I've heard, people are actually imagining a life when abortion is illegal, essentially illegal. That energizes Republicans, but that certainly energizes Democrats as well.
Brianne, during the debate and off to the side, I heard comments from people who said that Republican legislative leaders did not have the votes to pass this bill, and that there were pro-life Republicans who said what Kay said. We got elected to take care of the pro-life movement. You got to come up with the votes on that, or we're not going to vote for your tax bill. We're not going to vote for your budget bills. Was that going on?
There was a lot of that going on in the days leading up to the vote and in the weeks leading up to the vote. There were a group of Republican senators who said, you know, you need our votes to pass these critical budget bills to close down the session and to continue funding government. And we're going to withhold those potentially unless we move some of this legislation in some way, shape, or form. We want to vote on this. So we saw that, and in the House, the vote was 51 Republicans to get it through. They had the bare minimum to get that passed. So I think there was certainly some behind-the-scenes negotiating and conversations about what can we do to get these people on board. And some of that was adding in new exceptions. We saw new exceptions in some cases of rape and incest, fetal anomaly, things like that. So there was a lot of negotiating about how can we get this to a point where we've got the votes.
Joyce, another issue that's taken a lot of time, at least among politicians, is this whole controversy over the Iowa Finance Authority. The governor learned of sexual harassment in the agency, quickly fired the director, but now there's more controversy. What's happening?
Well, you know, the initial response from the governor herself, and I think from a lot of people, was she did the right thing. She learned this really severe sexual harassment going on by the director, Dave Yepsen. She did the right thing. She fired the offender. And I think she can still make that case to voters and anybody who criticizes her. But then there were, you know, reversals that raised some questions about her judgment and maybe about even the people who are advising her. She said, we have no documents. Then yes, we do have a document. She revealed the document. We're not going to investigate. Yes, we are going to investigate. So those things are now questions before at least for her, you know, people who are following her, if not for voters.
Well, is there some bad staff work going on this issue? I mean,
it would appear, David, that yeah, there's not a plan that they're following, that they're making decisions on the fly. And as Joyce was saying, there's, you know, we're not going to release it, we release it. We're not going to investigate, we investigate. And so it makes the governor and the governor's office look bad, like they're not really thinking these things through. I'm sure the governor will try to make the case that she made the right decision in the first place. And when you see the letter that was released, I think most people would agree she made the right decision.
This has a lot of, go ahead.
Well, there's something else that happened this week. The governor appointed her 78-year-old father to the Iowa Judicial Nominating Commission, a group which recommends nominees to the governor for judicial openings around the state. And one of the Democrats in the Senate Minority Leader Janet Peterson, in reference to another issue, used this phrase. She referred to the governor's friends and family plan. Because I think this thing could hang around for a while because Yepsen was a longtime ally. The governor and Dave Yepsen, the now fired director of the Iowa Finance Authority, were county treasurers together. They lobbied legislators, and he came into government at the same time she did when she became lieutenant governor. Governor Branstad appointed him in 2011. And so there's some discussion about what's going to happen with this investigation that she has now ordered. And legislators waded into this at the end of the week. They are going to require a report from this investigator to them about what's going on in that agency.
Brianne, does any of this on the Iowa Finance Authority have any traction with voters out there? I mean, it's a big story inside the Capitol, a lot of chatter and buzz. But does the average voter really care about it?
That's a great question because we're all in the Capitol building every day and it's all anyone can talk about. But outside of our walls, I don't know how much this resonates with voters, but I think compounding this on top of some of the other things we've seen with the Kirsten Anderson case, with the Bill Dix resignation, I think voters are tuned into this issue, especially in light of the Me Too movement. So I think it does have the potential to stick with her, and depending on how this investigation goes and what's revealed.
But I think what she has working for her is that she has said from day one and through today, I'm protecting the confidentiality of the victim. Well, that resonates with people. Right. I think she's going to be okay going before voters and saying that.
But there's a financial element of this, too. Mr. Yepsen orchestrated a $17 million move for the agency, and he was given authority by the board of directors that oversees this agency to spend up to $100,000 a year at his own discretion. So I think those financial shenanigans may actually be worse in the end as opposed to this discussion about the Me Too movement.
And the Iowa Finance Authority spending issue comes on the heels of the ICN, where the now fired director also spent lavishly on himself and his friends. And while I'm not sure that you can tie any of that directly to the governor, it's out there.
Right.
And her opponents are certainly going to try to tie it to her and her administration, the crony capitalism.
Right.
And so it's going to be another issue in the campaign through the fall.
Well, and especially since there's a third-party report that said it really didn't need to move this office. It could have stayed right where they are. I wonder if this is a thing that just sort of, there's a cumulative effect of all this. Any one of these is not enough to really hurt the governor, but the cumulative of it is to kind of give voters the impression things aren't quite right in Des Moines.
Yeah.
James?
Yeah, it's death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, none of them are fatal, but when they look at all of them in total, there's some mass there.
Speaking of cuts, let's talk about taxes. The legislature's working on a big tax bill. Why has it taken Republicans so long to get a bill passed?
Well, it's a big tax cut, and there's sort of a difference of philosophies. Senator Randy Feenstra wanted a bold tax plan. Representative Guy Vander Linden over in the House talks about being prudent and reasonable and responsible. He's not a fan of bold in tax plans. But it's a pretty bold plan. It's a $100 million tax cut next year, $2.7 billion over 6 years. Feenstra describes it as a complete rewrite of the Iowa tax code, which goes beyond simply cutting taxes to broadening the tax base, expanding sales tax on retail online sales, ride sharing, the apps you subscribe to, and ringtones. When you buy a ringtone, you're going to pay sales tax now. I don't know if anybody buys ringtones, but
I can't figure out the ones I've got.
But as far as why it took so long, Senator Feenstra was out with his multi-billion-dollar tax plan last summer. Then we have all of the pre-session discussions, and the Republican leaders in the House, from day one, it was clear that they were not as much on board with this. When you would ask them, what should we expect to get from you? They were more likely to say, responsible. We want to make sure that we can still fund state government properly. So that was out there. And so it really, in some way, it wasn't that surprising, because that's one of the things they were disagreeing about was, can we afford this big tax cut?
Brianne, as we look at this session, which is wrapping up, are there any winners and losers, people who did well, people who came out ahead, or people who didn't come out so well, in your mind?
Well, I think the governor's staff is certainly going to say that she was the big winner this session. She accomplished a lot of the things that she laid out in her condition of the state address. She signed a water quality bill. That was the first thing she did. She's got this tax reform. She did some work on mental health and expanding access to that in the state. So I think that's certainly something you're going to see on the campaign trail, is people pointing to this as her first major achievement as her administration.
Well, and you look at this session, Brianne, and don't you have to say it is historic, whether you like what they did or not. You add up those things you just mentioned, and this starts to become one for the record books.
Absolutely. There was a lot that happened. People work a long time to get taxes through, and so we saw that happen in just a couple of months this year. We saw taxes. We saw this historic abortion legislation that could see a Supreme Court challenge.
Kay, what's your take on this? I went back and looked at, you look at some of the histories of legislative sessions, and I think you have to go back to about 1965 when the Democrats took the trifecta in the Goldwater landslide. And it was a huge session.
They created the community college system.
Is this on a par with the 65 Democratic session?
It is, and I was struck a couple of years ago having a conversation with a reporter who had covered a couple of other state legislators. I said, so what is the difference between the state legislature in Missouri and the state legislature in Iowa? And he said, these Iowans are so all about policy.
Really?
which I found really interesting. And if you look at some of the policy measures that were sort of aren't rising to the level, Brianne mentioned mental health. I'll also mention the opioid bill that cleared both the House and the Senate with universal approval. And so they're tinkering around the edges there, maybe. They didn't limit the number of pills that a prescriber can issue in a single prescription. But they did tackle that issue in a way that I think heading into this session you were sort of skeptical, given the reluctance among some Republican legislators to limit what doctors can do when they're doctoring.
James, I was impressed by how disciplined Republicans have been. I mean, they had their agenda, and they passed it. I mean, voters voted for it. But.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure they'll make the case that we did what you elected us to do, you know, and they can go right down the list on collective bargaining, taxes, abortion, all these issues, major issues for the Republican Party, and say we delivered. You know, as we talked about earlier, that also energizes your opponents. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
Well, let's switch gears and go to the primary. I'd like that. The big marquee race is the Democratic primary. For governor. Let's go around the table. I'd like just everybody's handicap on how that six-way race looks, okay?
I think this will be decided at a state convention. I don't think any of these candidates have as yet had a breakout moment. No one has had an ad talking about doing something to hogs like Joni Ernst did to break out of that pack in 2014. And I think if you would look at any of the polling data in this race, these candidates are widely unknown. If there's one person that I think may be a sleeper, it's John Norris. He's campaigning a lot in rural Iowa. And when you go to state convention, people come from all over the state. They just don't come from Des Moines and Davenport and Council Bluffs. So I think he may be doing a real convention strategy.
Well, and what's your take on the race, James?
Well, I agree with Kay. They're all sort of campaigning for the state convention, which makes, in some ways, makes it a very boring race because they're afraid to say anything that might not play well with the voters. John Norris, I mean, it's just clear that he's banking on a state convention and being the choice, everybody's second choice. So that's sort of a strategy. The other thing that strikes me about this race is I'm surprised at the strength and energy Kathy Glosson has shown. She's no stranger, no novice as far as organizing, but she's really kind of a newcomer to politics. This is her first time she's ever run for office. And she has a lot of support. You can call them the Bernie Krats, the bold progressives, whatever you want to call them. But I'm surprised by the strength she's showing. I think when she got into the race, people wouldn't have thought she'd still be a factor at this point.
Joyce, how do you see the race? We should specify when we talk about going to the state convention that Iowa law requires a candidate to get 35% of the vote in a primary, or it has to go to a convention. So I'll clear that up. But well, what do you think of this race?
Well, I agree that it's a very good chance that it's going to go to a convention. And, you know, there's a lot of precedent in Iowa for maybe the second most popular candidate coming out ahead, and Congressman David Young is a perfect example of that. Congressman Steve King was chosen in a convention. Just one more point about John Norris is that he has some of the most relevant experience. Not that that really matters in a race, but he has some of the most relevant experience having worked in a governor's office in the past.
Right. Brianne? Fred Hubble has the most TV ads.
Exactly. If there's one benefit to be had right now, it might be in the fundraising arena. Fred Hubble has a lot of fundraising, a lot of personal wealth he can fall back on when some of these other candidates are being constrained by Iowa's campaign finance laws. Candidates can't raise outside money until 30 days after the legislative session ends in a gubernatorial race. And so people like Nate Bolton, who's got a lot of labor endorsements, who could be pulling in that money, won't be able to do so until right up against the primary, when it's not going to be helping him that much.
And we've just about exhausted those 30 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, there'll be no time left to write. Joyce, one of the, Ron Corbett, former Speaker of the House, was trying to challenge the governor in a primary, came up short in signatures. How could that have happened, number one? And secondly, is that a good thing or bad thing for the governor not to have a primary?
Well, I'm sure Ron Corbett is asking the same question. How could that have happened? There may have been something wrong with his strategy for where he went to get the signatures, because if he was going to Republican events, people there were very excited about Kim Reynolds, so that there may have been and then, you know, he just didn't count and make sure he had more than enough. But you know, I don't know how much the Reynolds people were thinking about Ron Corbett. I don't know if they would have agreed to a debate, and if they had, that would have been good experience for Kim Reynolds, who's largely untested in that arena.
You know, I think back to October of 2009, and Terry Branstad came rushing out of retirement to run for governor in 2010, and he gave a speech out at the state fairgrounds among a group of candidates who were running, and he basically stopped speaking for a little bit. It was an uncomfortable amount of seconds where he just sort of forgot what his speech was. Mm-hmm. And he got better as it went along, got back in the saddle, learned how to ride the bicycle again. But I think having someone to go head to head and explain yourself, be challenged, is healthy. And so she may be have escaped something that may have prepared her well for a general election contest.
Brianne, another candidate who had trouble with petitions was Teresa Greenfield in the 3rd District, didn't qualify for the ballot. Did the Democrats lose their one of their best candidates, at least, when she didn't make the cut?
They certainly lost a strong candidate. She was doing really well with fundraising, had some big endorsements. So I think the Democrats obviously were disappointed to see her go, but they've still got Cindy Axne, who's a businesswoman. They've got Pete D'Alessandro, who was a consultant and worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign, Eddie Morrow. So I think there are certainly some people to fall back on, but there's no question that they lost a strong candidate.
Is there any one of those three that you think is a favorite now? Or is it?
I wouldn't say that there's anyone that I see pulling ahead at this point. It's still early, and I think beyond a lot of the really, close-knit Democratic circles, people aren't tuned in necessarily to those congressional races yet.
I'm sort of surprised that Greenfield hasn't endorsed. I think that may happen at some point. If she threw her support to one of these candidates, I think that could be a real big factor in this race.
James, what about your home base up there in Northeast Iowa? The Democratic primary to take on Rod Blum.
There's a 4-way race there. Courtney Rowe from Cedar Rapids and George Ramsey from Marion, Tom Heckroth from Cedar Falls, and Abby Finkenauer from Dubuque. So we got kind of the population basis of that district covered. Most people see this as a 2-person race between Abby Finkenauer and Thomas Heckroth. Finkenauer has a lot of endorsements, a lot of support from Emily's List, NARAL, labor unions. Thomas Heckroth is one of those Obama alumni who's running for Congress now. He worked in the Obama administration like John Norris and Jim Maurer, who's running for Secretary of State. Talking to people last weekend at the district convention, a lot of undecided. I think it remains to be seen which way this race goes, but I think it's really a 2-person contest.
That race is a prize worth having,
Definitely.
Because
this district is listed among the top 10 likely to flip from Republican to Democrat. It's an area that it's kind of gone back and forth. Part of that district was represented by Cooper Evans, if your memories go back that far. Jim Nussle had part of that. Then Bruce Braley had part of it, represented this district. So it's gone back and forth. It went heavy for Donald Trump in the last election, and it remains to be seen whether those voters will stick with Republicans.
Joyce, just a few minutes left. In western Iowa, Steve King has a primary, a Republican challenger. Don't see much of her. And then the Democrats are having a primary. Is this a year that Democrats finally get together and beat Steve King, or is he headed for another coronation ceremony?
That is just a tough district for Democrats to crack, even in a year like this when there's a lot of enthusiasm. No matter how outraged you might be by things that King says, people have been outraged before, and he's always managed to come through. Candidates are going to be able to raise some money from out of state on this because Congressman King has become so notorious in his remarks, and I think sometimes you think it's intentional to be notorious in his remarks, but I don't think I'd put much money on any of these Democrats to actually dethrone him.
Okay, we've just got about a minute left. There's another primary that sort of flies under the radar, and that's for Agriculture Secretary on the Republican side. How's that look?
Right. Bill Northey left this position, and the governor appointed his deputy to replace him. Northey endorsed that deputy, and his name is Michael Negg. He's been traveling the state, but there are a group of other candidates who are traveling the state. They come from the ranks of the commodity groups. They come from the ranks of the Farm Bureau. So they're known to niche audiences around the state. I think this thing may be decided at state convention too, because I don't think very many people know. These are not household names. There may be some fall off when people vote in the primary, but this is the only game in town for Republicans on a statewide basis. So it's a really interesting campaign to watch.
Well, we will definitely keep our eye on it. I want to thank all of you for taking time away from the Hill and to be here today, and we'll be back soon to talk more about this. And thank you for joining us. We'll be back with another edition of Iowa Press next week at our regular times with our guest, Senator Charles Grassley. Iowa's senior senator joins us Friday night at 7:30 and Sunday at noon on our main IPTV channel, with a rebroadcast on our .3 World channel Saturday morning at 8:30. For all of us here at Iowa Public Television, I'm David Yepsen, and thanks for joining us today.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
I'm a dad.
I am a mom.
I'm a kid.
I'm a kid at heart. I'm a banker.
I'm an Iowa banker.
No matter who you are, there is an Iowa banker who is ready to help you get where you want to go. Iowa Bankers, allowing you to discover the genuine difference of Iowa banks.